um, the first one to call me was Admiral Moon to congratulate me. And I said, well, you're the guy that told me that wasn't going to happen. He said, well, I'm going to tell you. He said, Admiral Waters was the chairman of your board. And he said, I was on the board and I voted for you not to have the job because other people should have a chance. And Admiral Waters quoted to me the precept of the board, the most qualified person that has applied. And he asked the question, is there anybody on this list that applied for this job that is more qualified than him? And he said, very honestly, there wasn't anybody on that board that could say, yeah, there's somebody else more qualified. He said, so enjoy it. So I thought that was pretty big of him to call me and be as honest as he was with it. And I get his take on it because he was a real administrator within the reserves and was trying to.
You talk about how you got IBU 22 back in shape. 21, I always felt was a bunch of pirates, and that was kind of their reputation. But I'll tell you, their skills on the water were incredible, and there was none of that. There was none of that us and them, as far as opportunity to train and get on the boats, because that's all we did is we just trained and trained and trained. But I do recall that when we look back at it, and I think it was from a lot of conversations with you, which is why I really wanted to talk to you, not only about your career, but other aspects, was that, a lot of things after Vietnam, changed, right? You had the Zumwalt Navy, you had, a complete different culture. They took away our heritage a lot with the uniform changes. Mm-hmm. And I do understand, reading Zumwalt's book was fascinating. Where he did write, trying to go from a draft Navy to a volunteer Navy, trying to find that right mix to get people to join when the military wasn't looked on very highly. They were trying to kind of subscribe to the way of the times, right? Makes fashion in vogue, and my God,
let them have long hair and beards, yeah.
Yeah, 1970s. If there was ever a time in history where you didn't want to match the style at the time, it would have been then. But that's okay. And as we look from a warfare point of view, the fleet itself was decimated. I mean, spare parts were hard to come by. I was in cryptology. I was using equipment from the 1950s. I was reading teletape in 1985. It's incredible. I was on your ship, the Valdez, doing ComSec missions back then with equipment that was so outdated.
I remember we strapped that trailer onto the flight deck.
There you go. Yeah. Thank God for bosun's mates putting that thing back on there. But it was interesting. But one of the aspects of it that was curious to me is because they had special boat units, but they were very small. They weren't special warfare back then. That kind of changed. In the 2000s, where they started to really focus on the training and the skill set. Now I have no proof of anything, but from what I read from Operation Just Cause in Panama and other elements of what the boat guys were used to, it seemed to me that the inshore boat units turned everything on its ear. The level of training, the coxswain quals, the weapons quals, the engineer. You and I are alike. I was not a very good engineer, but I got through those quals, and they were hard. And if you didn't get through it, if you didn't get through it, you couldn't be a coxswain, you couldn't be a patrol leader, nothing. So I guess it's a long-winded question. Just trying to see if my theory is right at all. But the influence of IBU, kind of the notoriety, because we got a lot of press. For a very small unit, for many years, in what we were assigned to do, that it kind of amped up. And I thought, put the special boat units, and then they became the special boat teams. On a course that made them far more elite than they ever were.
Well, I think you're absolutely correct. I think the inshore boat units, because initially the initial plan with them was they were going to be deploying the sonar buoys for the MIUW units. That was really the first genesis of them. And then they talked about loading a tail on the IBU boats on a reel and having that go out and deploy that, the like the tail that they deploy from the NASW tail.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the boat that they apparently were trying to put it on, they almost sank because the reel was too heavy and completely unbalanced the boat, blah, blah, blah. And it didn't work. So then they decided, geez, we're going to figure something else out here. Well, the guys that were in those units at the time said, port security, escort stuff, even some riverine stuff. And the Navy had no riverine capability at all because they completely did away with it after Vietnam, as they did after every conflict where they needed small boats.
Mm-hmm.
When they were done, they did away with it, including the Civil War, World War I, World War II.
Well, the UDTs shrunk pretty big too.
They did. They absolutely did. And we could thank Kennedy for the establishment of the Special Forces guys, the Green Berets, the SEALs, and that sort of stuff, that were the genesis of what we have today. The IBUs, when they were freed from being a adjunct to the Muse, became far more valuable, became a value set unto themselves. And because they did, because units like 21 and 22, in 21, yes, had the reputation to be pirates, but their boat handling skills and their skills in the water, second to none. 22, a little different, didn't have the reputation as pirates, just as good on the water. Been with both units, so I love them both.
Oh, sure.
And you look at the different units up and down the coast. I would take the East Coast units over the West Coast units any day of the week. The West Coast units almost sort of had that West Coast kind of surfer boy kind of attitude that, everything will be fine.
Now, doesn't every unit on the West Coast somehow wind up with that reputation?
They do, and okay. I think it's deserved.
Do you? Okay.
But then again,
to our West Coast listeners, if you want to come on and refute any of this, you're more than welcome.
Please do. And you West Coast guys, you've done great work. But we East Coast guys have a different view of that. So the IBUs, again, became an entity unto themselves. And after the coal got blown up, when they took the first volunteers over to Jebel Ali and set them in there to do the port security and high-value escort stuff, really set the groundwork for people paying attention to what these IBUs were capable of. And when that happened, for those guys who were volunteers over there, for the units that weren't there yet, they realized their time was going to come. And they started training really, really hard. Not that they hadn't done that before, but then weapons qualifications became a huge deal.
Oh, VBSS, all of it, yeah.
And I can remember fighting with group when I became, even when I was an XO, and more so when I was a CO, about the non-combat expenditure allowance. You're not giving me enough bullets. Well, that's all you're going to get. Okay, good. So when I report sorts next month, I'll report that, we're not combat ready. Well, why? Because we haven't shot enough. I need more bullets. Well, yeah, blah, blah, blah. And as units deployed, and I found this with units that I talked to when I was at Squadron, even after I came back when I was at IBU 21, guys were going over there. I said, when you go over there, when you're training with weapons, it's not non-combat expenditure allowance. It's combat allowance because you're in the combat zone. Never mind asking about NCEA. Forget it. Take every bullet they give you, shoot it up, and tell them you need more. And if you don't get more, you're not qualified. Trust me, they'll give you more. There are plenty of bullets out there. And I drove group crazy. Drove them absolutely crazy. But you know what? Give me the bullets, or my guys aren't qualified. And if they're not qualified, we're not deployable. And then you can answer to your boss.
I can see in my show notes for this, there is going to be a lot of Navy speak and initials and acronyms. I'm going to have to update people. That's what happens when two old sailors start speaking. You start speaking the language. But from a career point of view, Commander, what's as we kind of started the show off, and as we kind of come to this portion of your service, and I'm just wondering, from riverine warfare in Vietnam to commanding a boat unit at the end of your career, were there any other folks in coastal warfare that you ran into, especially in the officer ranks, that had served on PBRs in Vietnam?
Captain Popesca.
Oh, I
as a
remember
matter of
Captain
fact.
Popesca. Yes.
Captain Popesca
He
served
went
on.
on a similar journey as you.
He did. He
Yes.
did. He was an engineering duty officer, but he made. I think he made senior chief. He may have made master chief engineman before he got commissioned. But interestingly enough, he went to the Barcelona about the time he left the USS Barcelona. I got there, so we kind of, he was just a little bit ahead of me. You want to talk an American hero? He won't tell you, but Rick Popesca is an American naval hero.
I didn't know of his history. I just knew he was prior enlisted. That's all.
Yeah, prior enlisted. He was wounded in Vietnam on the rivers,
Was he?
on PBRs. He was. He might be somebody you might want to put on your list for interviews. And so he and I always had sort of a good relationship, because when we discovered that I kind of followed him in certain places, plus the PBR background. Now, Commander Popesca, Captain Popesca, when he retired, never had command of a boat unit. He had command of a MEU, so he never had the boat unit. But to go from being a third class and a second class petty officer on the boats, and like I said, basically worried about myself, to commanding a boat unit in coastal and riverine warfare from 1970 to 2002 and 3 and 5, and then 7 and 8 on my last deployment, was an incredible journey. And probably the single hardest thing to do as a boat unit CO was and we did all the required training, and I was just horrible. I just drove them crazy with the training, because I knew at some point I was going to have to let them go and go over the horizon, and I couldn't be with them, and I couldn't see them, and I couldn't say, hey, no, do this, do that. I had to make sure in my own mind, in my own heart, that I had trained these guys well enough, trusted them enough, that I knew they were going to react properly and do the right thing. So the first time I stood in the control tower at Fuge and watched those boats leave the harbor going out for an escort, and once they were out of my visual sight, was scary. I probably wore a hole in that floor up there, pacing, waiting to hear over the radio that they had established contact with the escort, that they had taken up positions, things were going fine, and that, no, they didn't inadvertently go into Iranian territorial waters, and we're not starting World War III. Thank God.
Right.
I had my version of the strategic corporal, as they talk about in the Marine Corps. You take these guys, you give them weapons release authority, and then you let them go over the horizon. And you just pray that you've done the right job and trained them well enough. And I always told the crews, I will back you with every ounce of my fiber, as long as you're right. If you're wrong, you'll pay the price, as will I.
Sure.
But if you're right, you have no better friend than me. Just make sure it's right. Make sure it's right. And I just wanted the crews to understand that, and to be responsible for, instead of just being responsible for BM3 O'Malley, to now be responsible for, at the end, I had close to 200 sailors I was responsible for my last deployment as the task group commander in the Emirates. And I had people in multiple locations. And it was an awesome responsibility that I absolutely reveled in, because it's what I wanted my entire life. I got what I wanted. I wanted command of Navy units in a combat zone during a war. I had it, and I thank God and I thank my sailors that they did such a fabulous job that everybody came home safe and sound, and every mission got accomplished the way it needed to be accomplished, and they did themselves proud.
That's a nice feeling. I think that, when you look back at it, Commander, when I say sometimes it's what you don't say more than what you do say, that can get